Hi class, today we're going to be talking about photography, an introduction to humanities. Let's get started. So there's a little bit of history involved with photography because it is a fairly recent medium or fairly recent style of art expression, if you will. Um, Photography began in Paris in 1839 with a man named Louis Daguerre, which is where we get the term daguerreotype, which was sort of this first way of putting an image onto a surface. So he used silver plated copper. So this process here, it was chemically treated then to make it light sensitive, and then it was exposed using a camera. So we can kind of about the way a camera works, right? We open up the lens, the light comes in, it stamps the image onto light sensitive paper in our case, or what do you call it, negative. And then you transfer that to a piece of paper, to something that's more permanent. Okay, so again, here it was then fumed with mercury vapor, which would remove the light sensitive chemicals, and then you would rinse it and dry it, and then you would have your daguerreotype. So this was the first publicly available photographic process. And this right here is actually Louis Daguerre in 1844. I don't know where his neck went, but here he is. He's an important guy. So you have to think about the time. Okay, we discussed painting, and we want to really think about this as a departure from the painting. Again, this is sort of happening in the mid 1800s, mid to early 1800s, and painting is very much still alive and well during this period. Paul de la Roche was a painter. He painted this right here, Execution of Lady Jane. This was 1843. And he was famous for saying, painting is dead, when he went to the unveiling of the daguerreotype. So he saw the photograph and he said, painting is dead. So we want to consider sort of how photography threatened this idea of painting. Now, the camera at the time, now maybe today's cameras can, but at the time the camera could not yet reproduce the large size or the colors or the precise detail that make De La Roche's painting powerful. So if we're looking at this painting here, what would you say might be De La Roche's strengths? So why do you think a photograph would be threatening to him? So think about this. Now, if we look very closely, this painting has an incredible amount of detail. It's very, very lifelike. Look at this. When I look at particularly at the like the executioner, I mean, he looks like he could just step off the page and walk into the world. I mean, he's very, very lifelike and realistic. And so De La Roche, he's very good at representing the representing something that's actually happening, or representing when we talked about presentational immediacy, which we don't have here. We really do have a sense that this is representing something in the real world. And so just like photography, now photography is actually a snapshot of of the actual thing that took place, whereas painting is just a representation of it or a copy of it. So we do gain a sense that someone like De La Roche might have been threatened by the introduction of the photograph. Experiments in early photography. Okay, so again, this is a very new medium, and so photographers in the early 1800s kind of began to figure out, how are we going to control detail, and how am I going to tell any kind of story, any kind of message? And this control helps inform the viewer about the subject matter, right? So this tells us about the subject matter, and then we're also kind of slowly moving into a sense of content, or do we gain any meaning from this? So how is the focus of this picture in particular here? This is Robert Howlett. This is Isambard Kingdom Brunel. This is 1857. And he's taking a photograph of a steamship builder in this particular photograph. And so think about the focus here. Again, what's in focus, what is not in focus, and how does that contribute to subject matter and content? So I want to come back to this when we do our discussion, but be thinking about kind of how these early photographers began to create a sense of subject matter and a sense of content. Early photography. This is Julia Margaret Cameron, and she was photographing Sir John Herschel. This is 1867. And Cameron captured this image of Herschel, and Herschel is the chemist who was responsible for discovering how to make an image permanent using sodium thiosulfate. And he shared this discovery with Daguerre, who we just looked at, which made the daguerreotype possible. So he's very much an equal sort of player in the development of photography, and he's actually the person that's responsible for coining the term photography. So he's an important guy. We want to think here about what Cameron did to achieve an effect here. So this is very, very highly contrasted. Okay, when we're talking about contrast, we're talking about very dark darks and very white whites, very highly contrasted. So what did she do to achieve this effect? Well, she sort of draped him in this dark cloth, making everything very dark except for his face, right? His face is very, very highly illuminated. His hair is it's white. We consider it's sort of washed out. And it kind of makes this sort of halo or ring around his face. So all the attention, all the light is going straight to his face. This is a photograph here on the left of Charles Baudelaire. This is 1870. He was a French poet, and he was known for being very opposed to the photograph. So I don't know why he, decided to pose for one, but he called it art's most moral enemy. And he believed that photography could capture a moment, but that it could not create art. And our text calls him a champion of the imagination, and he was imitating an art sort of bowing down to reality. So he kind of suggested that it's not art's job to show reality. Photography can show reality, but we're going to champion the imagination, in the arts, in painting, etc. And then on the right here we have Timothy O'Sullivan. This is Canyon de Chelly in Arizona. This is 1873. We can come back and look at these for our discussion here. Keep moving. The pictorialists, I kind of want to look at a couple different groups of photographers and how their work evolved over time. The pictorialists were a group of photographers in the late 1800s who used realistic paintings as their models for photographs. So their works are very highly composed. We would get a great sense of what we would call perceptual unity, if you remember that term from our early discussions. Again, this is the imposed order on a work, right? So it's very highly stylized, very composed and controlled. So they really try to avoid distracting details, try to have something very balanced, very carefully controlled images. The subject matter is usually very carefully centered, as it is here. And they were often criticized for sentimentality, which is this idea of sort of oversimplifying or cheapening emotional matters. So they were not seen as very sensitive to that, and not very sort of realistic, that they just oversimplified. Okay. Next we have straight photography. This was pioneered by Alfred Stieglitz. And this is this idea that photography shows things as they are, however ugly it is. And so they would just take snapshots of anything and anything. It might not be beautiful, it might not be perfectly composed, but it's this idea that a photograph should show life as it is. The F64 group emerged from this idea of straight photography. This was the group of straight photographers in the 1930s. They used a small aperture, so everything is in focus. Again, when we're thinking about straight photography, we're thinking about just a snapshot of things as they are, not trying to make them more beautiful. Um, and so a small aperture means everything's in focus. Nothing's being blurred out, nothing's being emphasized. It's just life as it is. Okay, so they used a small aperture. They were proponents of fine print. And these photographers, particular photographers, reacted against this idea of sentimentalism and pictorialism. So they kind of were anti-pictorialists. And this group included Edward Weston, a few important names, Ansel Adams, and Imogen Cunningham. So when we're talking about fine print, we're talking about the art and the time that they took to make a final print. When we're talking about prints, remember we're moving back before the days of digital photography when you had to go into a dark room and make a print, right? So they would take days even to carefully create this final print that had exact tones in certain areas that they wanted to be emphasized, okay? So the photograph itself was a snapshot of life as it was, but then they would take a lot of painstaking time to make the perfect print in the darkroom. Okay, so this is the F64 group. Here's a couple of works produced by the F64 group. The first is Edward Weston. This is Nude, 1963. Again, sorry, I'm showing you a nude woman here. But the interesting thing here is that, of course, this woman is not wearing clothes, but this really has more to do with her line, shape, and proportion. Her identity is hidden, and she's not. So the photographer's not really interested in who this person is, but more the line and shape of the body that can be portrayed here. Then we've got Ansel Adams on the right. This is Church, Taos Pueblo in 1941. We've got very intense tones here in different areas of the photograph. He had to choose his timing perfectly when the light was hitting the interior and the tops of the walls, and the rest of the walls are in shade. So we look at the left side of this wall here is very heavily shaded. Got very dark contrast here, this shadow, back here, and then this is contrasted with the light that's reflected here and here. So we've got very interesting sort of play on shadow. And this is Ansel Adams. So again, this reflects a lot of work in the darkroom here. Another group of straight photographers were the documentarists. These were photographers who had to work carefully to preserve a record of a moment before it disappears. So this time is crucial here, of course, because time is fleeting, right? And so if you snap a moment, that moment's never going to happen again. So it's this sense of what your text calls the decisive moment. So the photographer really had to know when was the decisive moment to snap the photo. So this is when shapes and spaces kind of would come together at just the right moment, and then you would snap the photo at the decisive moment, and you're capturing this sense of fleeting time. So these are the documentarists. And this is Paul Strand. This is Wall Street, New York, 1916. And these are two other works of documentarists. The first is Henri Cartier-Bresson, Behind the Gare Saint-Lazare. This is 1932. Again, we've got this person moving here on the right side of the photograph. So this requires speed and instinct, and this is an example of that decisive moment that had to be captured here at the train station. And so if he had waited a second too long, this person would not have been in the frame. So this was just the precise moment here. If you look more closely, let me see if I can zoom in a little. You see a dancer here on a poster. And what's interesting here is sort of this running movement, or leaping movement, is mimicked by this running man. So that's a really interesting kind of snapshot moment that was taken. The the ripples in the pond here, making circular shapes, kind of echoing. We've got circular shapes here from the ripples. We've got this sort of echoing these circular shapes here. And then we've got sort of this balance of tones. We've got this very dark figure here against the light reflecting on the water. So very interesting composed. Of course, we've got this sort of visual axis, which we talked about in painting. Lots of lines happening here. So it's very interesting visually. And then on the right, we have Dorothea Lange. This is Migrant Mother, 1963. This is a very famous painting, which you may have seen before, documenting the Great Depression. Look at her face. What do you see in her face? It's an interesting, composition because she is this middle figure and she's got two children, one on either side, but we don't get their identities, we don't get their faces. They're just sort of framing the mother. So it's all about the mother, and we get this sense of grief or worry, anxiety that's on her face. She doesn't know where her next meal is coming from, and she's surrounded by her children in the midst of the Great Depression. Okay, a couple more here. The Modern Eye. This is a snapshot style of photography that requires us to look closely at the details. So if we look at the woman's face, what kind of expression does she have? What does it mean? Some of these photographs were criticized as being somewhat amateurish or sort of accidental, spontaneous. But what's interesting here is, again, this is sort of almost a documentarist kind of approach where we're capturing this moment in time. And again, it requires us to look closely at the details. So what kind of cards is the man holding? Do you think that this game is starting or is it ending? Who feels like they're in control of this moment? So these are a couple things to think about. We're looking at the Modern Eye. Lastly, digital photography. This is where we've kind of come to today. Photography today allows for portraits that could challenge paintings in detail and preciseness. So again, we talked about, the most early photographs couldn't compare to a painting, the detail in a painting, but today it far surpasses it. And it also makes altering photos possible. We can layer photos together. We can alter their contrast. We can change colors. We can Photoshop. We can edit a lot of different things. So we have so much creative control over a photograph. And it really frees photographers from any limiting equipment. This is Cindy Sherman. This is Untitled, number 466. Cindy Sherman's a really interesting study in photography. If you're interested in photography, I would suggest looking into her. She's best known for her Untitled series of photos. And really, she tried to kind of subvert stereotypes of women in media. So she does all these different self-portraits, changing her makeup, changing her looks in ways that make us think not about her, but really more about ourselves. And again, this is a very carefully composed photograph that looks like a painting. And we'll talk a little bit more on Wednesday about what belongs, what doesn't belong here. But this is Cindy Sherman, and we'll come back to her. So lastly, as we're summing up photography allows us to record reality faithfully. Okay, so we're taking this snapshot of what's happening in reality. And as the viewer, we're tempted to only consider what is presented, the subject matter, versus the way it has been represented, form. Early photographers, again, do not transform subject matter much, but it kind of started with the pictorialists, began being interested in form. And today, photography is becoming more interested in altering reality than transforming it. So there is quite an emphasis on altering reality. We'll talk more about this in our discussion. And it's still an evolving art form, still changing, right? A very accessible one when we're thinking about we can take a photo on our cell phones. So think about photography before our discussion. I want you to think about it. The way we can use it, our ability to use it. Does that cheapen it or does that make it more powerful? So those are some things to think about as we sum up our chapter on photography.